Imagine standing on a cold mountain peak where the wind howls like a funeral song, and instead of burying the dead, you watch as their body is cut into pieces and offered to vultures circling overhead. To Tibetans, this is not horror, it is holiness. The Tibetan Plateau is one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. At more than 14,000 feet above sea level, it is often called the roof of the world. The air is thin, the winds relentless, and the ground stubbornly frozen for centuries. Survival here has meant adapting to conditions that would break most people. But survival in Tibet has never been only about food and shelter, it has also been about the spirit. And no, where is this clearer than in the way Tibetans have treated their dead? In most cultures, burial means returning the body to the earth, a symbolic act of completing life's cycle. But in Tibet, the earth itself is nearly impossible to penetrate. The rocky ground and frozen soil make deep graves impractical. Firewood is scarce, too, making cremation difficult. So the Tibetan people turn to the skies. This ritual, known as jadar, literally means giving alms to the birds. It is a striking phrase, death as a final act of generosity, where the body is not wasted, but instead becomes nourishment for other living beings. For Tibetans, it is not a desecration, but a form of compassion, an acknowledgement that all life is interconnected. If you were to witness one, the ritual might at first appear unsettling. The body is brought to a remote mountaintop site called a dirtro, or sky burial ground. Monks chant prayers as the deceased is laid out on a stone slab. Special men known as rugyapas, or body breakers, carry out the next steps. They are not executioners but caretakers, performing what is considered an act of both duty and sacred service. The rugyapas carefully cut open the body, breaking bones and separating flesh, so that vultures can consume it more easily. Within minutes, dozens of huge Himalayan vultures descend from the sky, circling until they land, their wings spread wide, their beaks tearing into the body with efficiency. Within an hour, little remains except bones, which are then ground into powder, mixed with barley flour, and offered again to smaller birds. It is a ritual at once pragmatic and deeply spiritual. Pragmatic because in a land where resources are limited, it prevents decay, disease, and the waste of space or fuel. Spiritual because it reflects the Buddhist belief in impermanence. The body is seen not as the self, but as a temporary vessel. By feeding it to the vultures, the deceased's final act is one of generosity, helping another living creature survive. To Western eyes, this can seem horrifying. To see a human body devoured by scavengers feels like a violation of dignity. But to Tibetans, the true dignity lies not in preserving the body, but in releasing it. The act is not about the corpse, it is about the soul. Buddhist teachings emphasize that consciousness leaves the body at death, moving toward its next rebirth. The husk left behind is no longer you. And so, giving it to the birds is a final reminder that clinging to the body is meaningless. Yet, even in Tibet, sky burials are not performed for everyone. Infants, pregnant women, or those who died suddenly in accidents may not be offered to the birds, as their deaths are considered spiritually delicate. Some bodies are cremated when possible, or submerged in rivers. Still, sky burial remains the most iconic and widely practiced ritual of Tibetan death. If you imagine yourself standing there, high on the wine-whipped plateau, the scene becomes more than just unusual. It is strangely serene. The chanting of monks blends with the cries of the vultures. The family watches quietly, knowing that their loved one's body is being transformed into a life for another being. Death here is not an ending, but a continuation. This practice also reveals something important about how Tibetans view humanity's place in the natural order. While many cultures place humans above animals, Tibetans place them alongside. In death, a human body is no different from that of a yak or a goat, food for birds, part of the cycle. The humility in this acceptance is striking, especially compared to societies where elaborate tombs or embalming are meant to preserve the human body indefinitely. At the same time, sky burials serve the living as much as the dead. The ritual allows families to confront death directly, without disguising its physical reality. They see the body destroyed, but they also see the cycle of life continue. The vulture, often feared as a dark bird, becomes a sacred messenger in devouring the body. It carries the deceased into the sky, closer to the divine. Still, one must wonder, what was it like for the first people to witness such a ritual? How did they decide that feeding the dead to birds was not desecration, but sanctity? Was it born purely of necessity when other methods of burial failed? Or was it shaped from the start by deep spiritual ideas of impermanence? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between practical needs wrapped in spiritual meaning. After all, many burial practices across the world began as solutions to real problems. Mummification, cremation, even mass graves during plagues all arose not only from belief, but from circumstance. Tibet's sky burial may be one of the clearest examples of this union, where geography, climate, and faith all combined to shape one of the world's most unusual funerary rites. As the vultures rise into the thin Himalayan air, carrying away what was once flesh and blood, the family turns to leave. There is no grave to visit, no stone to mark the place, only the memory of the loved one and the knowledge that their final act was to feed life itself. But the question lingers, if the soul has already departed, and the body is nothing more than a vessel, why do the living still feel such a deep need to ritualize its disposal? Is it truly about the dead or about the living, who remain behind to carry the weight of memory? To begin, imagine the journey of the deceased before they reach the Dirtro the Sky burial ground. The body is usually kept at home for a day or two, during which Buddhist monks or lamas perform rituals meant to guide the consciousness of the departed. These are known as the Bardo prayers, coming from the Bardo Thodol, often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The word Bardo refers to the in-between state, the liminal space between death and rebirth. According to Tibetan Buddhism, when a person dies, their consciousness does not immediately enter a new body. Instead, it lingers in a transitional phase that can last up to 49 days. During this time, the soul is thought to experience visions, sometimes peaceful, sometimes terrifying, shaped by its own karma. The prayers chanted by monks are intended to help the departed recognize these visions for what they are, illusions of the mind, and to encourage the soul to move peacefully toward its next rebirth. For the family, hearing these prayers is comforting, a reminder that their loved one is not lost, but on a journey. When the day of the sky burial arrives, the body is carried by relatives and Rogyapas to the mountaintop site. This is no ordinary walk. The journey itself is symbolic, ascending toward the sky, closer to the divine. In some regions, it is accompanied by the steady beat of a drum or the blowing of a long Tibetan horn, its sound echoing across the barren landscape. At the burial ground, the monks resume their chants, sometimes incense is burned, not to mask the smell but to purify the air and invite positive spirits. The family watches from a respectful distance. Though grief is present, there is also acceptance. The body is about to be transformed, and with it, so too is the sorrow of those left behind. The Rogyapas then take over. Their role is vital but socially complicated. They are respected for their service, yet also seen as ritually polluted because of their contact with corpses. It is a paradox common in many cultures. The grave digger, the undertaker, the executioner, those who deal with death are needed, but also marginalized. For the Rogyapas, however, the act of dismembering a body is not one of violence, but of compassion. They are returning the body to nature in the way tradition demands. Once the body is exposed, the vultures descend. These birds, known locally as gin, are immense, with wingspans that can stretch nearly 10 feet to Tibetans. They are not mere scavengers but sacred creatures. They are thought to be manifestations of Dakini's female sky spirits who carry souls to heaven. Watching them feed is not a sign of desecration, but a reassurance that the cycle of life continues. The speed with which the vultures consume the flesh is often astonishing. In less than an hour, A full-grown human body can be stripped to the bone. What remains is then reduced further bones, pounded with hammers, ground into a fine mixture with barley flour, and offered again to smaller birds such as crows or hawks. Nothing is wasted. Everything is given back. For Tibetans, this ritual affirms the core Buddhist teachings, impermanence anicca, a non-attachment. The body is impermanent, a shell to be discarded. To cling to it is to misunderstand the nature of existence. By letting go literally, by allowing vultures to take it, the family practices the detachment that Buddhism so often preaches. Yet, when outsiders first witnessed sky burials, the reaction was very different. Early European travelers to Tibet in the 19th and 20th centuries wrote about the practice with horror, calling it barbaric or grotesque. Missionaries, in particular, saw it as evidence of heathen savagery. To them, leaving a body to scavengers was a denial of dignity, a shocking contrast to the Christian emphasis on burial and resurrection. But these outsiders failed to see what Tibetans understood: that dignity does not lie in preserving a corpse, but in recognizing its impermanence. To Tibetans, Western burial customs, with their sealed coffins and embalmed bodies, might appear equally strange, even wasteful. Why preserve what no longer holds life? Why hide death away beneath polished stone? Modern anthropology has softened these judgments. Today, sky burial is studied not as savagery, but as an ingenious adaptation to environment and belief. It is recognized as both practical given the lack of wood and soil and profoundly symbolic. What was once dismissed as grotesque is now appreciated as a spiritual ritual as rich and meaningful as any in the world. Still, the practice faces challenges in the modern era, with roads, urbanization, and outside influence spreading across Tibet. Sky burial grounds are becoming fewer and harder to maintain. Environmental laws sometimes clash with tradition, as vultures themselves decline in number. Some younger Tibetans, influenced by outside cultures, prefer cremation or other methods. Yet, sky burials endure quietly, defiantly, as a reminder of the unique worldview of the plateau. And so the question lingers as globalization and modern values continue to press upon Tibet. Will this ancient ritual survive the next century? Or will sky burials, like so many traditions, fade into memory, leaving only stories for future generations? The thin air of Tibet carries many things: monks' chants, the wings of vultures, and the unspoken truth that life is fragile and fleeting. In sky burial, Tibetans have long confronted this truth directly. But what does this practice mean today, in a world where traditions everywhere are vanishing under the weight of modernity? By now, you can see that sky burials are not only a way of disposing of the dead, but also a mirror of Tibetan philosophy itself. The practice rests on one central idea: impermanence. Life is always changing, bodies decay, and nothing material lasts forever. This lesson is not hidden, it is embraced. In a sky burial, death is not tucked away underground or hidden behind polished stone. It is visible, unflinching, and absolute. For Tibetans, this is not morbid. It is liberating. To see a body offered to the vultures is to be reminded that clinging to form, flesh, and possessions is meaningless. The person you love is not gone because their body is gone. Their consciousness moves on. What remains is simply a vessel, no more enduring than a footprint in the snow. And yet, humans everywhere have always struggled with this idea. Across cultures, we have built pyramids, mausoleums, tombs, and catacombs in an attempt to hold on to the dead. Even today, with modern embalming, we preserve bodies for decades in coffins that will outlast the memories of the person inside. Tibet, by contrast, has chosen a different path, one of release rather than preservation. In the 20th century, as Tibet came under greater outside influence, sky burials became a subject of fascination and controversy. Photographs and travelogues circulated in the West, often sensationalizing the practice. Too many readers, the idea of vultures tearing at a human body was shocking, almost unbearable to imagine. But as scholars began to explain the spiritual context, Attitudes shifted. What once seemed grotesque slowly began to appear profound. Today, sky burials remain an essential part of Tibetan identity, though not without challenges. Environmental pressures have reduced the vulture population in some areas, raising concerns about whether the ritual can continue as before. Urban growth means fewer families live near traditional burial grounds, and younger generations, influenced by global culture, sometimes choose alternatives like cremation. Yet many still insist that without sky burial, Tibet would lose something central to its soul. For families who do continue the practice, the meaning remains powerful. Witnessing a sky burial is not about shock, it is about transformation. The grief of losing a loved one is softened by the knowledge that their final act was one of generosity, feeding life in a land where life is hard to sustain. The vultures carry away more than flesh, they carry away sorrow, reminding the living that nothing is permanent, not joy, not pain, not even death. It is also worth asking how sky burials resonate with people far beyond Tibet. In an age when modern societies struggle to confront death openly, Tibet's approach seems almost radical. Where others avert their eyes, Tibetans look directly. Where others preserve, Tibetans release. Could it be that this so-called bizarre ritual offers a lesson for us all? Perhaps the lesson is this: death need not be feared, and the body need not be clung to. In returning the body to nature, sky burials remind us that we are not separate from the world, but part of its endless cycle. Just as we consume plants and animals in life, so does the earth reclaim us in death. As you picture the wind sweeping across the high plateau, the vultures circling against the vast sky, and the monks chanting softly below, consider this final thought. If impermanence is the only certainty, why do we resist it so fiercely? And if letting go is the essence of freedom, could the strange, unsettling beauty of the Tibetan sky burial hold a truth that modern societies are still unwilling to face? You've heard the legends of Vikings sailing across stormy seas, but fewer know what happened when a great warrior died. His final voyage was not in battle but in death, set upon a burning ship, drifting into the endless horizon. When we think of Vikings, we often imagine fierce raiders with horned helmets, though, in truth, those helmets are a myth. We picture long ships slicing through icy waters, warriors shouting as they strike coastal villages. Yet the Viking world was not just about war. It was also about honor, ritual, and the afterlife. And nowhere is this more vividly expressed than in their burial traditions. The image of a Viking funeral is iconic. A warrior's body placed upon a ship set ablaze and pushed out to sea, flames lighting up the northern sky. It is dramatic, poetic, and unforgettable. But was this truly how Vikings honored their dead, or is it a tale shaped more by legend than fact? To answer that, we must begin not with the fire, but with the ship itself. For the Vikings, the long ship was more than a vessel of wood and sail. It was a symbol of life's journey, a means of survival, and an emblem of freedom. A Viking might spend much of his life aboard one, raiding, trading, exploring, or simply fishing. To be buried with, or within a ship was to carry that symbol into the afterlife. The idea of a ship burial is deeply tied to Norse beliefs about death. Vikings believed that the soul traveled on after death, entering realms shaped by how one lived. Warriors who died in battle were thought to be chosen by Odin, carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla Grand Hall, where the fallen feasted eternally and prepared for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of time. Others might go to Falkvanger, ruled by the goddess Freya, or to Hell, a colder, quieter realm that was not necessarily punishment, but lacked the glory of Valhalla. In this cosmology, the journey mattered. Just as a ship carried a Viking across seas, so could it carry the soul across the threshold of life and death. A burial ship was not just a coffin, it was a vehicle to the beyond. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed that ship burials were real, though not always as Hollywood imagines them. In places like Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, entire ships have been found buried beneath mounds carefully packed with goods, animals, and treasures. These graves belonged to high-ranking individuals, chieftains, nobles, perhaps even queens. The dead were surrounded by the things they might need in the afterlife: weapons, jewelry, food, and even sacrificed servants or animals to accompany them. But what about the fiery send-off at sea? Accounts are mixed. The most famous description comes from an Arab traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Viking funeral on the Volga River around the year 922. He described how a slave girl volunteered to die alongside her master, how she was ritually killed, and how the body of the deceased was placed upon a ship, which was then set ablaze. His words have long fueled the image of Vikings sending their dead out in flames. Yet, historians debate how widespread this practice really was. Fire consumes wood quickly, and a burning ship set adrift would soon sink. More often, it seems, ships were buried on land, covered by mounds of earth, preserved for centuries until archaeologists uncovered them. The fiery funerals may have been rare, symbolic acts reserved for special occasions, while ship burials on land were the norm. Still, whether by fire or soil, the essence remained the same. The ship was the final bed of the honored dead. It was a sign of status and strength, a reminder that even in death, a Viking remained a traveler, bound for the next world. Imagine, for a moment, standing on a fjord at dusk, the cold air sharp against your skin. The villagers gather, torches in hand, as the body of a chieftain is placed aboard his ship. Beside him lie his sword, shield, and helm, along with goods he will need in the afterlife. The flames catch, crackling upward as the ship drifts away, sparks scattering against the darkening sky. To the living, it is both farewell and hope, the belief that the dead sail onward, carried into legend. But this raises questions that go beyond spectacle. Why did the Vikings devote such immense resources to ship burials? What does it reveal about their values, their fears, and their vision of life after death? These questions will carry us deeper into their world, where burial was never just about the dead, but also about the living, those who remained behind, needing to remember, to honor, and to define what it meant to be a Viking. When archaeologists uncovered the Osberg ship burial in Norway in 1904, they stumbled upon one of the most extraordinary finds in European history. Beneath a grassy mound lay a 70-foot-long ship, still largely intact after more than 1,000 years. Inside were the remains of two women, likely of high status, perhaps a queen or a priestess, and her companion. Around them were objects of staggering variety and craftsmanship: carved sledges, wooden chests, richly woven textiles, kitchen tools, and even animal remains. The burial was not simply about honoring the dead. It was about equipping them for eternity. The Osberg women were sent into the afterlife with all the tools of daily life, as if their journey would continue much as it had on Earth. Their ship was not a coffin, it was a floating household, prepared to carry them across the cosmic seas. Another sight, the Gokstad ship burial, revealed a man of high rank, perhaps a king or chieftain, buried around the year 900. Alongside his body were weapons, gaming boards, and the remains of horses and peacocks, birds not native to Scandinavia, suggesting they were imported as symbols of wealth and status. The presence of exotic animals tells us something important. Viking burials were not only about faith, but also about power. They proclaimed to the living community, this was a man of immense prestige, whose death deserves the finest of honors. Sacrifice was another element. Accounts like that of Ibn Fadlan describe how slaves or servants were sometimes killed to accompany their master into the afterlife. In his story, a young girl volunteered to join her deceased lord, was ritually intoxicated, stabbed, and then lay beside him on the ship before it was set ablaze. Archaeological evidence supports parts of this account. In some ship burials, the remains of multiple people have been found, raising the possibility that they were sacrificial victims. But why such elaborate preparations? At its heart, Viking burial was about more than honoring the individual. It was about maintaining the social fabric. Funerals were community events, where wealth was displayed, alliances reinforced, and the hierarchy of society reaffirmed. By burying a chieftain with treasures and sacrifices, the living both honored him and reminded themselves of the power structure that bound them together. The symbolism extended to the smallest details. A sword placed beside a warrior was not just a weep on, but a reminder of his bravery. A spindle or loom given to a woman reflected her role in maintaining the household and weaving the fabric of society itself. Food, drink, and even livestock symbolized abundance, ensuring that the dead would never hunger in the afterlife. Ship burials also reflected the Viking worldview of death as a journey. The goods were provisions for the voyage ahead, just as supplies were stored before a sea expedition. The idea that life and death were continuous journeys gave these funerals a resonance that went far beyond spectacle. Of course, not every Viking received such honors. Most were buried in simpler ways, cremated on pyres, placed in graves with modest goods, or left with little ceremony. Ship burials were reserved for the elite, rulers, great warriors, or those whose status demanded recognition. For the majority, death was marked with less grandeur, but the beliefs were the same. Every burial, large or small, reflected the conviction that the soul moved on, and that the living must provide for that passage. The image of a burning ship, then, may not have been common in reality, but it captures the essence of Viking burial, the blending of spectacle, spirituality, and social order, whether by fire or by earth. The ship remained the central symbol of vessel carrying the dead into legend. But this raises another question. Were these burials truly about the dead, or were they more about the living? Did the grand ships and treasures serve the departed soul, or were they meant to remind the community of its own values and obligations? The grandeur of the Viking ship burials continues to echo long after the flames of the pyres died, and the soil covered their wooden hulls. These funerals were not fleeting spectacles. They created legacies, shaping how the dead were remembered and how the living understood themselves. For the Viking world, memory was power. To be remembered was to live on, not only in Valhalla or some distant realm of spirits, but in the hearts and songs of the community. Ship burials ensured remembrance. The mound raised over a chieftain's ship became a landmark on the landscape, a visible reminder to all who passed by of the greatness that once walked among them. Even in death, the leader held influence, commanding respect from those who gazed upon the earth that hid his vessel. This remembrance was not accidental. Saga literature, though written centuries later, often refers to the burial mounds as points of reference, places where oaths were sworn, where gatherings took place, or where battles were fought nearby. The grave itself became a symbol of continuity, linking generations across time. Archaeology confirms the persistence of these memories. Excavations at sites like Bor and Osberg show that mounds were sometimes reopened, looted, or reused in later centuries, whether for practical reasons or symbolic ones. This act of revisiting suggests that the living continued to interact with their dead long after the funeral was over. Death did not end a relationship. It transformed it. The myths surrounding Viking death also found life in other cultures. Medieval chroniclers exaggerated tales of burning ships sailing into the night sky, turning ritual into legend. Later, in the 19th and 20th centuries, romantic writers and artists revived the imagery, embedding it into popular imagination. Even today, in films, novels, and video games, the fiery funeral ship is the defining symbol of Viking death, an enduring echo of rituals that may have been rare, but left a lasting mark on cultural memory. But what do these burials tell us beyond their drama? They reveal a universal truth. Death is as much about the living as it is about the dead. The treasures placed in the ship were gifts of respect, but they were also displays of wealth, binding communities together in shared recognition of hierarchy. The sacrifices made may have honored the deceased, but they also reinforced the idea that loyalty extended even beyond life. Every element carried meaning for those who stayed behind. In this way, Viking ship burials remind us that funerary customs are never just about the passage of one's soul. They are about reaffirming values, strengthening bonds, and leaving markers of identity that endure through centuries, whether through flame, soil, or story. The Vikings found ways to ensure that their dead were not simply lost, but woven into the fabric of time. And so, as we look back on the silent ships resting beneath grassy mounds, we might ask, was the true journey of the Viking dead across cosmic seas? Or was it the voyage of their memory carried forward endlessly in human imagination? Imagine walking across a quiet marshland on a misty morning. The ground feels soft, spongy, and ancient beneath your feet. Suddenly, beneath layers of peat and moss, you see something unexpected. Not just wood, not just stone, but the leathery face of a person who died thousands of years ago, still eerily intact as though sleep has only just claimed them. These are the bog bodies of northern Europe, human remains preserved for centuries in the cold, acidic wetlands of Denmark, Ireland, Germany, and beyond. Unlike skeletal remains, bogs preserve skin, hair, and even stomach contents, offering a hauntingly intimate window into lives long past. They are not mere bones, they are whole people, suspended in time, their deaths written across their faces and bodies. The first major discoveries of bog bodies came in the 19th century, when peat cutters stumbled upon strange corpses while harvesting fuel. At first, many thought they had uncovered recent murders, so vivid were the body's features. Only later did archaeologists realize these remains were thousands of years old, dating from the Iron Age, some as far back as 2,000 years ago. Perhaps the most famous is the Tallinn man, discovered in Denmark in 1950. His face is so peaceful that one might believe he is simply asleep. His eyelashes, beard stubble, and closed eyes are still visible, preserved by the unique chemistry of the bog. But around his neck lies a rope, revealing that his end was not gentle. He was hanged, a victim of ritual sacrifice or execution. Other bodies tell similar tales. The Graubale man, also from Denmark, bears a slit throat so deep that it is hard to imagine the violence of his last moments. The eyed girl in the Netherlands was strangled with a woolen band, her long red hair still startlingly vibrant after 2 millennia. Many bog bodies show signs of violent deaths, throats cut, skulls crushed, or multiple injuries inflicted at once. Why were these people killed and placed in bogs? Scholars debate this endlessly. Some argue they were criminals, executed for their crimes. Others see evidence of ritual sacrifice, offerings to the gods of fertility, war, or the harvest. Still others think they might represent social outcasts, punished and hidden away. The truth may be all of these at once, depending on the time, place, and culture. What is certain is that bogs became graves unlike any others. The waterlogged, oxygen-poor environment acted like a natural preservative, halting decay. The peat tanned the skin like leather, leaving the dead looking hauntingly lifelike. To modernize, they are reminders of mortality. To ancient societies, they may have been sacred gifts to unseen powers. The bog bodies hold secrets not just of their deaths, but of their lives. Scientists have examined stomach contents, discovering meals of grains, seeds, and sometimes meat final suppers frozen in time. Analysis of hair and nails reveals traces of the environment, diet, and even seasonal patterns of nutrition. These details allow us to imagine not just how these people died, but how they lived ordinary days of farming, weaving, or herding, ending in extraordinary deaths. And yet, the most haunting part of encountering a bog body is not the violence, but the intimacy. To look at the Tallinn man's face is to feel a connection across 2,000 years. He does not appear distant like a skeleton in a museum. He looks almost like someone you might pass on the street, someone with thoughts, fears, and a story now lost in the peat. Still, the questions remain unresolved. Were these victims chosen willingly as sacred offerings, or unwillingly as scapegoats for their communities? Were they honored in death, or erased in shame? The violent ends of the bog bodies have long puzzled historians and archaeologists. Hanging, strangulation, stabbing, or blows to the head. Such brutal deaths suggest that these individuals were not buried by accident, they were deliberately killed, and their placement in bogs was intentional. But the question is, why? One interpretation sees these deaths as ritual sacrifices. The Iron Age societies of Northern Europe worshipped a pantheon of gods tied to fertility, war, weather, and the cycles of nature. To secure good harvests or victory in battle, communities might have offered human lives, believing the gods demanded nothing less than the blood of men and women. The bog, wet and fertile, may have been seen as a portal to the divine, a place where gifts could be given to the earth itself. The evidence often supports this theory. Many bog bodies show what scholars call overkill, multiple injuries that go beyond simple execution. For instance, the Lindo man, discovered in England in 1984, suffered what has been called a triple death. He was struck on the head, garroted with a cord, and then his throat was cut. Such elaborate methods suggest symbolism rather than mere punishment. It was as if each wound represented an offering to a different god, ensuring no spirit was left unappeased. Yet another interpretation points to punishment and justice. Some bodies bear signs of execution rather than sacrifice. The bogs may have been used as places of banishment, where criminals or social outcasts were both killed and hidden. In this sense, the bog became a place not of honor, but of shame, a dumping ground for those whose memory was meant to be erased. Still, the lines blur. Could not a criminal execution also serve as a religious ritual, satisfying both the gods and the community's sense of justice? The Iron Age was not a world of clear distinctions. Life, death, and religion were intertwined in ways that do not easily fit modern categories. The bogs themselves add to the mystery. To ancient people, wetlands were liminal spaces, neither land nor water, both fertile and treacherous. They were places where the human and the supernatural met. Placing the dead in such landscapes might have symbolized sending them to another realm, sealing them away in the earth's watery embrace. What is striking is the consistency of these practices across regions. From Ireland to Denmark, from Germany to the Netherlands, bog bodies tell similar stories of violent deaths, careful placements, and symbolic gestures. This suggests a shared cultural logic across Iron Age Europe, a worldview where life could be offered up to ensure survival, prosperity, or divine favor. Scientific analysis deepens the picture. Pollen grains found in stomachs reveal that many bog bodies ate ritual meals shortly before death, often porridge mixed with seeds, or unusual ingredients not common in daily diets. Some contain mistletoe pollen, a plant with sacred associations in ancient European religion. These details reinforce the idea that these deaths were ritualized, not random. Even their clothing tells stories. Some were buried naked, stripped perhaps to humiliate them or to purify them. Others wore fine cloaks or belts, suggesting status. The Holdremos woman, found in Denmark, was wrapped in a sheepskin cape, animal garments dyed with rich colors, evidence of wealth and care even in death. Taken together, the bog bodies reveal a society that used death to communicate meaning, whether sacrifice, punishment, or ritual remembrance. Their placement in the bog was not just disposal, but a message encoded in violence and preservation. And yet, despite all the analysis, the mystery remains. Were these people chosen willingly, martyrs to a cause we can no longer understand? Or were they victims of power, condemned to die in service to beliefs they may not have shared? The story of the bog bodies does not end in the Iron Age. Their afterlives have unfolded in laboratories, museums, and imaginations across Europe. Each discovery pulls them from the silence of the peat and places them into the modern world, where they continue to provoke wonder, fear, and reflection. From the mid-20th century onward, advances in science allowed researchers to treat bog bodies not as curiosities, but as rich archives of information. Radiocarbon dating fixed their ages, revealing that many came from the early centuries BC and CE. Forensic analysis traced the blows and wounds with precision, reconstructing the violent ends they met. CT scans and facial reconstructions gave them back their human features, reminding us that these were once people with identities, not anonymous relics. Perhaps the most intimate revelations came from stomach contents. The Graubeil man's last meal, for instance, was a porridge of barley, flaxseed, and wild plants, spiced with traces of fungus that may have been toxic. The Talon man's final supper was a coarse gruel of grains and seeds, simple but ritualistic. Such details, frozen in time, bring us closer to the rhythms of their lives, harvests, meals, and the rituals that surrounded both. But beyond the science lies the deeper question of how these remains are remembered and displayed. Museums across Denmark, Ireland, Germany, and the Netherlands have placed bog bodies in glass cases, dimly lit, where visitors stare at leathery faces thousands of years old. For some, it is a moment of awe, as if time itself has folded. For others, it is unsettling, a confrontation with mortality that feels to intimate. Unlike bones, these bodies still look like people. Their hair, nails, and skin blur the line between past and present. The ethical debates are real. Should these remains be displayed at all? Are they scientific specimens, or should they be respected as the dead once were, left to rest? Some museums choose replicas instead, showing casts while preserving the originals in controlled storage. Others argue that to hide them is to deny the chance to learn from them. The debate continues, as unresolved as the questions surrounding their deaths. What is undeniable is the emotional weight they carry, standing before the Talon man, with his closed eyes and peaceful expression. One cannot help but wonder what he thought in his final moments. Was he resigned, honored to be sacrificed, or terrified? A victim forced into a fate he did not choose. His silence offers no answer, only reflection. The bog bodies also force us to think about how societies use death. They remind us that rituals, however strange they may seem, serve purposes of meaning-making. They connect the living to forces larger than themselves, whether gods, community, or memory. To study them is not just to uncover how people died, but how people lived and believed. In this sense, the bog bodies are not merely archaeological finds. They are mirrors. They reflect humanity's universal struggle to make sense of mortality, to control the chaos of life and death through ritual, sacrifice, and remembrance. And as you picture them lying in their peat beds, skin darkened, but intact expressions frozen for eternity, you are left with a question that no science can answer. Do they belong more to the world of the living or to the silence of the past? High above the crowded cities of Persia and India, on isolated hilltops, stand strange circular stone structures. They have no roofs, no shrines, and no graves dug beneath them. Instead, they are open to the sky. If you had approached one century ago, you would have seen a haunting sight. Rows of human bodies laid out in neat circles, their arms crossed, their eyes closed, left exposed to the waiting vultures overhead. These places are called dogmas, more widely known as the Towers of Silence. They are part of the Zoroastrian faith, one of the world's oldest religions. Founded by the prophet Zoroaster in ancient Persia more than 3,000 years ago. Unlike burial or cremation, Zoroastrians practiced what is known as exposure, placing the dead on raised stone platforms, so the birds and the elements could strip away the flesh, leaving only clean bones. To outsiders, this practice can appear shocking or morbid, but to Zoroastrians, it was an act of profound respect, rooted in their understanding of purity and cosmic order. According to their beliefs, the body of a dead person is unclean, corrupted by evil forces known as Druge. To bury it would contaminate the earth, and to burn it would pollute fire, both of which were sacred elements in their religion. The solution was to place the dead where they could no longer defile. The natural world on the Towers of Silence, open to the cleansing forces of sun, wind, and scavenging birds. The design of these towers reflected careful ritual order. At the center of the circular platform lay a deep well for the bones. Around it were 3 concentric rings, the outer ring for men, the middle for women, and the inner for children. After the flesh had been consumed, the bones were collected and placed into the central pit, where lime and sun completed the work of purification. This process was not random, but guided by priests who oversaw every step with prayers and rituals. The journey of the soul, they believed, depended on purity. For 3 days after death, the soul hovered near the body, before beginning its crossing of the Chinvat Bridge, a mythical passage where it would be judged. Proper exposure on the tower ensured the soul was freed from the taint of the decaying body and could move forward unburdened. What makes the Towers of Silence so striking is not just the ritual itself, but the way they embody a worldview that placed cosmic order above all else. Life and death were not private matters, but part of the eternal struggle between truth and falsehood, purity and corruption. To handle the dead carelessly was to tip the balance toward chaos. Yet, for all their logic within Zoroastrian belief, the Towers raised questions even among their contemporaries. Greek and Roman writers who encountered these customs described them with fascination and horror, unable to grasp why anyone would offer their dead to birds. To them, the absence of burial seemed a denial of dignity. But for Zoroastrians, it was the highest form of reverence, returning the body to the natural cycle without staining the sacred elements. As you imagine the silent towers standing against the horizon, with vultures circling above and priests chanting below, you may wonder, what did it feel like for a community to gather here, watching their loved ones disappear piece by piece into the sky? The Towers of Silence were not only architectural spaces, but social and spiritual centers. Their function extended far beyond the act of exposure itself. They represented the collective responsibility of a community to maintain purity, to protect the natural world, and to uphold the cosmic balance that Zoroastrians believed sustained the universe. Central to this process were the Nasasalar, ritual caretakers responsible for handling the dead. These men came from families whose roles were passed down through generations, marked by both reverence and stigma. They were highly trained in ritual purity laws, for touching a corpse was considered dangerous, risking spiritual contamination. Special tools, such as metal tongs and white garments, were used to minimize contact. Every movement was prescribed: how the body was washed, how it was carried, how it was laid out on the stone platform. Nothing was left to chance. Even the timing of exposure mattered. The body was placed on the tower as quickly as possible, often within hours of death, so that the process of decay would not advance too far. Zoroastrian texts describe in detail the prayers and recitations that accompanied these acts, ensuring that the soul's journey remained on the right path. For the family, grief was tempered by duty. They mourned their loved ones, but they also celebrated the release of the soul from earthly corruption. The vultures themselves became agents of purification. Their speed and efficiency in consuming the flesh were seen as a blessing, a sign that the ritual was proceeding as it should. Communities often observed the process from a respectful distance, taking comfort in the fact that the natural order was working to cleanse the body. When vultures were absent, however, the ritual became more troubling. Without them, decomposition slowed, and the process of purification seemed incomplete. This reliance on nature created challenges. In India, where many Zoroastrians, known as Parsis, settled after fleeing Persia, the towers remained active for centuries. But in the 20th century, the population of vultures in India plummeted due to poisoning from pesticides and veterinary drugs. Without the birds, the Towers of Silence could not function as intended. This crisis forced debates within the community. Should alternative methods be adopted, or should the ancient ritual be preserved even in difficult conditions? Beyond the practical details, the towers reinforced social bonds. Funerals were communal events where families and neighbors gathered not to witness a burial but to affirm their shared faith. Death was not hidden away but integrated into the rhythm of life. The towers, high and visible, reminded everyone that mortality was part of the cosmic order, not a secret to be concealed. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts suggest that exposure rituals were remarkably consistent over centuries. Though local variations existed, some towers were simple circular enclosures. Others were carefully constructed with drainage systems to carry rainwater away. In all cases, the emphasis was on containment and separation. The dead were placed apart from the living, ensuring that corruption did not spread, while purity was preserved. What emerges from this practice is a striking worldview, where many cultures saw burial as a way to honor the dead. Through possession graves filled with goods, tombs filled with symbols, the Zoroastrians saw dignity and release. The body was not to be preserved or celebrated as an object, but returned swiftly and cleanly to the elements. Still, such practices raise lingering questions. How did families reconcile the pain of loss with the sight of vultures descending on their loved ones? Did they find comfort in the ritual's meaning, or did sorrow sometimes clash with belief? As the modern world expanded, the ancient practice of exposure came under growing strain. What had once been central to Zoroastrian identity now stood at a crossroads. Challenged by environmental changes, urban growth, and shifting cultural attitudes, the decline of vultures in India was perhaps the most dramatic challenge. In the late 20th century, populations of these birds plummeted by more than 90%. Studies later revealed that a veterinary drug, diclofenac, widely used in cattle, was poisoning vultures that fed on carcasses. For the Towers of Silence, this collapse was catastrophic. Without vultures, bodies remain on the platforms for days, even weeks, exposed to the sun but not consumed. What had once been a swift and purifying process turned into something unsettling, even distressing. Communities debated possible solutions. Some suggested introducing solar concentrators, large mirrors that focus sunlight to speed up decomposition. Others advocated for enclosed towers where natural decomposition could proceed in controlled conditions. A few even argued for cremation, despite its contradiction of Zoroastrian purity laws. Each proposal revealed the tension between tradition and practicality, between faith and adaptation. At the same time, urban growth placed new pressure on these rituals. Towers once built on isolated hills now find themselves surrounded by expanding cities. In Mumbai, one of the last strongholds of the Parsi community, the Towers of Silence stand in Malabar Hill, a neighborhood now crowded with modern apartments. For some residents, the idea of open-air exposure within sight of their homes created unease. For Parsis, however, the site remained sacred, a link to centuries of practice. Yet even as the ritual declined, its cultural significance endured. For Zoroastrians, the towers represent more than a method of disposal. They are symbols of a worldview, rooted in balance and respect for natural elements. The act of giving one's body back to the sky embodies the belief that life and death are inseparable parts of the cosmic struggle between order and chaos. To abandon the practice entirely would feel, for many, like losing a vital part of their heritage. Outside observers, too, have found in the Towers of Silence a striking reminder of humanity's diversity in confronting death. In a world where burial and cremation dominate, the idea of exposure stands apart, offering a different way of understanding dignity and remembrance. It challenges us to see the body not as a possession, but as part of a larger cycle, where even in death, humans contribute to the balance of nature. Some historians suggest that the ritual's persistence despite centuries of criticism, colonization, and modernization reveals its deep resilience. Others see in its decline a story of how fragile ancient practices become in the face of ecological and technological shifts. Both perspectives highlight the Towers of Silence as more than a curiosity. They are a window into how belief systems adapt, endure, or fade. And so, when you picture those stone circles on lonely hilltops, with their quiet platforms open to the sun, you might wonder, will future generations of Zoroastrians continue to climb these towers, placing their dead under the watchful sky, or will the silence one day be absolute, with the ritual remembered only in history books? On a cold northern shore, the wind sweeps across the fjords, carrying the smell of salt and smoke. In the distance, A crowd gathers beside a long wooden ship pulled up onto the land. Its curved prow rises like the head of a dragon, painted with bold colors that stand out against the gray sea. The people watch in silence as the body of a warrior, dressed in fine clothes and surrounded by weapons, is carefully placed inside. For the Vikings, this was no ordinary burial. It was a journey to eternity. The Viking ship burial remains one of the most iconic and mysterious funerary practices in world history. More than just a grave, it was a symbol of the voyage the dead would take into the afterlife. For Norsemen, death was not an end, but a passage, and the ship central to their culture of exploration and raiding was the perfect vessel to carry a soul toward its destiny. Some ship burials were set ablaze and pushed into the water, their flames lighting up the night sky. Others were buried in the earth, covered with mounds of soil that still rise across Scandinavia today. Archaeological discoveries, like the famous Oseberg ship burial in Norway, reveal not only the grandeur of these rituals but also the meticulous detail with which they were carried out. The Oseberg burial, uncovered in 1904, held the remains of two women surrounded by treasures, wagons, carved wooden animals, and household goods. Every object spoke of wealth and status, suggesting that these women were of great importance, perhaps even queens or priestesses. Other ship burials contained warriors, laid to rest with their swords, shields, and sometimes even sacrificed animals to accompany them on their journey. What set these burials apart was their symbolism. For a seafaring people, the ship was not just transportation, it was freedom, power, and identity. To be buried in one was to carry that identity into the afterlife. The Vikings believed in multiple realms of existence. Warriors who died in battle might enter Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where they would feast with Odin until the end of the world. Others might journey to Falkvanger, the field ruled by the goddess Freya, or to Hell, a quieter realm for those who died ordinary deaths. The ship burial was therefore both practical and spiritual. It gave the dead the tools for their next life and honored them in this one. But it also reflected the Viking belief that death was not a private matter but a communal ritual. Families, clans, and sometimes entire villages gathered to witness these events, affirming the shared values of courage, loyalty, and honor. As you stand in your imagination among the mourners on that northern shore, watching flames rise or soil cover the dragon-headed ship, one question lingers. What did the living truly believe lay beyond the horizon of death? The ship burials of the Vikings were far more than acts of disposal. They were performances of belief, layered with ritual and symbolism that connected the living to the dead and both to the gods. Archaeological evidence and sagas describe ceremonies that were complex, sometimes unsettling, and always deeply meaningful. The act of preparing the body began with care. The deceased was washed, dressed in fine garments, and laid out with objects that reflected their role in life. Warriors received swords, shields, and spears. Women received jewelry, weaving tools, and household items. Leaders were surrounded by symbols of power, such as staffs, wagons, or animals. These objects were not merely possessions, but essential tools for the afterlife, ensuring that the dead could continue their roles in the next world. Sacrifice often accompanied the burial. In some accounts, animals such as horses, oxen, and dogs were killed and placed alongside the body, believed to serve as companions and helpers. In rare and more dramatic cases, human sacrifices were performed. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Viking funeral on the Volga River in the 10th century, described in vivid detail how a female slave was chosen to accompany her master in death. She was treated with ceremony, given intoxicating drinks, and then ritually killed before being placed on the ship beside him. To modernize, this account is shocking, but to the Vikings, it symbolized loyalty and ensured that the deceased would not journey alone. Fire was another central element in many burials. The ship itself was set ablaze, either on land or as it drifted out to sea. The flames carried the soul to the heavens, a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. The sight of a burning ship, crackling against the night, must have been unforgettable, a spectacle that seared memory into the community, as much as it honored the dead. Burial mounds, on the other hand, represented permanence. When ships were covered with earth, they became lasting monuments to the deceased. Some were built so large that they dominated the landscape, visible reminders of power and legacy. These mounds often became gathering places for rituals, celebrations, and even later burials, tying the living community to the memory of its ancestors. What makes the Viking ship burials especially fascinating is their dual role. They honor the individual while also reinforcing communal values. Each ritual reaffirmed the belief in courage, loyalty, and the inevitability of fate. The community's presence at these funerals bound them together, not only in grief but also in the shared hope that their own journeys would one day be guided with equal honor. The sagas hint that these rituals carried more than symbolic weight. The Vikings believed that how one was buried could influence where the soul traveled. A warrior sent off with fire and steel might find his way to Valhalla, while a farmer buried with his tools might dwell in the quiet fields of hell. The ship was not just a coffin, it was a compass, pointing the soul toward its destination. Yet with so much care and ceremony, one question persists. Did the Vikings truly believe they were sending their loved ones to feast with the gods? Or were these rituals as much for the living, ensuring that grief could be transformed into meaning? As the Viking Age drew to a close in the 11th century, the grand ship burials that had once defined the Norse way of death began to fade. The rise of Christianity across Scandinavia brought with it new ideas about the body, the soul, and the afterlife. Church leaders discouraged pagan rituals, replacing them with burials in consecrated ground, simple graves marked by wooden crosses or stone slabs. The ship, once a vessel of both life and death, was no longer considered necessary for the journey beyond. Instead, salvation was said to come through faith, baptism, and the promise of resurrection. Slowly, the elaborate rituals of burning ships, human sacrifice, and mound building gave way to the quiet uniformity of Christian cemeteries. Yet the memory of ship burials never truly disappeared. Archaeological discoveries across Scandinavia and beyond have preserved these practices in striking detail. The Osberg ship, discovered in 1904, remains one of the most extraordinary finds of the Viking world. Buried around 830 for CE, it contained women of high status, along with richly decorated wagons, tapestries, and animal remains. Its preservation allows modern historians to glimpse not only the artistry of Viking shipbuilding, but also the symbolic richness of their funerary customs. Other discoveries such as the Gokstad ship and the Tun ship further illustrate how varied these burials could be, some grand, others more modest, yet all bound by the belief that a ship was the right vehicle for the soul as passage. In Britain, too, ship burials appear, most famously at Sutton in England, where an Anglo-Saxon king was laid to rest in a buried ship, a reminder of how far Viking and related traditions spread. What endures most, however, is not just the ships themselves, but the ideas they carried. The Viking view of death as a journey requiring preparation and courage has fascinated generations. The burning ship has become a lasting symbol in literature, film, and even modern memorials, echoing the ancient belief that fire and sea could bridge the gap between life and eternity. For descendants of Norse culture, these burials represent both pride and mystery. They remind us of ancestors who faced death with ritual, symbolism, and a belief in something beyond the horizon. And for those outside the culture, the sight of a ship rising in flames on the water remains one of the most haunting images of human history, a mixture of grief, honor, and hope in the end. Ship burials show us that death, no matter the culture, is never just an end. It is a reflection of what people value most: courage, loyalty, family, or faith. The Vikings believed that their dead sailed toward new worlds, their ships cutting through unseen waters. But perhaps the true journey was the one they left behind, in memory, legend, and history. And so as you picture a long ship vanishing into fire and waves, one question lingers. Were the Vikings preparing their loved ones for the afterlife? Or were they building monuments for themselves, ensuring that no one could forget the people who once ruled the northern seas? Imagine walking into a small hillside cemetery in 19th century Mexico, expecting rows of simple graves, and instead finding something entirely different. Bodies that refused to turn to dust. Their skin, though shrunken, clung tightly to bone. Their faces, frozen in expressions of surprise, sorrow, or even screams, stared back at the living. This was no deliberate act of embalming or ritual preservation, it was nature itself that had created the mummies of Guanajuato. The story begins in the mid-1800s in the city of Guanajuato, a silver mining hub in central Mexico. Like many towns, it operated a local cemetery where families paid a burial tax to keep loved ones interred. When families could not afford to pay, officials exhumed the remains to make space for others. But what they found shocked them. Many bodies had not decomposed in the ordinary way. Instead, they had dried out naturally, preserved by the unique conditions of the soil, the arid climate, and perhaps the mineral content of the earth. Word of these accidental mummies spread quickly. Locals were astonished at the sight of familiar faces, eerily intact years after burial. Over time, more and more such bodies were unearthed, creating a collection unlike anything seen in Mexico before. Unlike the carefully wrapped mummies of Egypt, the Guanajuato mummies were dressed in their burial clothes, sometimes still wearing shoes, hats, or rosaries clutched in stiff hands. The most haunting aspect was their expressions. Some appeared calm, their mouths closed and hands folded neatly. Others seemed to be caught in silent screams, their jaws gaping, their eye sockets wide. These faces fueled rumors that some had been buried alive, though historians believe the contorted features were simply the result of natural contraction during mummification. Still, the image of people trapped in eternal horror gave the Guanajuato mummies a reputation both terrifying and fascinating. For decades, they remained stored in the cemetery, occasionally shown to curious visitors. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they had become something more, a tourist attraction. Small groups of travelers came to view the rows of preserved corpses lined up in dusty corridors, each with its own story. Miners, mothers, infants, soldiers, priests. Death had become part of the living city, not hidden away but displayed for all to see. What makes the Guanajuato mummies especially remarkable is not only their accidental preservation, but what they reveal about cultural attitudes toward death in Mexico, in a land where the Day of the Dead celebrates memory, ancestors, and the thin line between the living and the departed. These mummies became an almost natural extension of that worldview. They were reminders that death is never far away, but also that the dead remain with the living in unexpected ways. Yet, even as they fascinated locals and visitors, the mummies raised deeper questions. Were these preserved bodies a source of honor, or a violation of the dignity of the dead? Did they serve as historical witnesses, or had they been turned into mere curiosities? The mummies of Guanajuato might never have become famous if not for a simple matter of economics. In the 19th century, the local government enforced a burial tax, a fee that families had to pay to keep their relatives interred. If the tax was not paid, the grave was opened and the remains were removed to make space for others. This practice was not unique to Guanajuato, but the results there were unlike anywhere else. Instead of finding skeletons or dust, gravet diggers discovered perfectly preserved corpses, some only a few years old, others decades in the ground. As more and more mummies accumulated, they were stored in a series of underground crypts. At first, the practice was purely practical. There was no intention of creating a collection. But word spread quickly through the town and beyond. Locals began visiting these crypts, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of morbid fascination. By the late 1800s, the mummies had become something more than exhumed remains. They were attractions in their own right. Tourists from Mexico, and abroad started to come. The sight of dozens of mummified bodies, lined up shoulder to shoulder, each with distinct features and expressions, created an atmosphere both eerie and unforgettable. Mothers with preserved infants in their arms, children in tiny shoes, men with mustaches still visible, each figure seemed to tell a silent story of life interrupted. Some visitors recoiled in horror, others marveled at the mystery of their preservation. Over time, the cemetery caretakers leaned into this fascination. For a small fee, visitors could tour the crypts, where the mummies were displayed in open niches or propped against walls. The practice blurred the line between respect for the dead and the commercial lure of spectacle. Guides told stories, some true, others exaggerated, about who these people were, how they had lived, and why their faces bore such dramatic expressions. The mummies even entered popular culture. Writers, artists, and filmmakers drew inspiration from their unsettling presence. In the 1970s, they appeared in a series of Mexican horror films, cementing their reputation as figures of both fascination and fear. For many, they became symbols of Guanajuato itself, a city where death was not hidden away but made part of the public imagination. At the same time, the mummies reflected deeper cultural themes. In Mexico, death has long been seen not only as an end, but as part of a cycle. The Day of the Dead celebrations, with their altars, marigolds, and offerings, treat the departed as continuing members of the family. The mummies, preserved by accident, fit naturally into this worldview. They were not gone, but still present, still watching. Their survival was interpreted less as a violation and more as a reminder that the past lingers among the living. Yet, debates grew. Was it right to display the dead in such a way, especially those who had no say in their fate? Were they being honored as a cultural treasure or exploited as curiosities? These questions continue to shape how the mummies are treated today. As visitors walk through the dim corridors of the crypts, confronted by row upon row of dried faces, one thought must have lingered in their minds. Were these mummies truly silent relics of the past? Or were they unwilling participants in a story that was still being written? By the late 20th century, the mummies of Guanajuato had become more than a local curiosity. They were a global phenomenon. Thousands of visitors came each year, drawn by the eerie faces and the mystery of their preservation. To accommodate this interest, the city opened the Museo de las Momias Museum of the Mummies in 1969, creating an official home for the collection. Today, over 100 mummies are on display, making it one of the most unusual museums in the world. Yet, the decision to turn the mummies into a museum exhibit sparked ongoing debate. On one hand, the mummies attract tourism, which brings significant revenue to the city. They also serve as historical artifacts, providing insights into 19th century clothing, burial practices, and the conditions that led to natural mummification. On the other hand, critics argue that these bodies belong to real people who never consented to become spectacles. Their dignity, some say, has been compromised for the sake of entertainment. Preservation itself has also become a challenge. While the dry climate of Guanajuato once preserved the bodies naturally, the conditions inside the museum are not always ideal. Exposure to light, humidity, and even the breath of countless visitors can cause damage. Efforts are now underway to better regulate temperature and display methods, ensuring that the mummies endure for future generations without deteriorating. Despite these concerns, the mummies continue to resonate deeply with Mexican culture. They embody the country's unique relationship with death, one that embraces its reality rather than hiding it away. Unlike in many societies, where death is sanitized and concealed, in Mexico, it is often confronted directly, whether through Day of the Dead festivities or through the unflinching presence of the Guanajuato mummies. For scholars, the mummies raise fascinating questions about the intersection of biology, environment, and culture. Why did some bodies mummify so perfectly while others decayed? How did local conditions, soil composition, altitude, climate combine to create this phenomenon? Each mummy offers clues, But the full answer remains elusive, a reminder that nature can preserve as powerfully as human. Ritual. For visitors, the experience is often more emotional than scientific. Walking among the rows of preserved men, women, and children is a confrontation with mortality. The mummies stand as stark evidence that death leaves traces, that the line between past and present is thinner than we might wish. They remind us, too, of the fragility of life. Many of the mummies are infants, their tiny forms still dressed in burial clothes, silent witnesses to the harsh realities of 19th century disease and poverty. And yet, in their very survival, the mummies have achieved a kind of immortality. They have become part of Guanajuato's story, shaping its identity, drawing people from around the world, and inspiring reflection on what it means to live and die. So as you picture those rows of silent figures, their faces frozen in expressions of peace or terror, one final thought lingers. Are the Guanajuato mummies a reminder of death's inevitability, or of life's strange persistence, where even the grave cannot silence the past?